The acoustic glass of the executive boardroom was designed to filter out the frantic, high-decibel energy of a corporate headquarters, reducing the chaos of 300 employees into a silent, cinematic blur. Inside the room, the atmosphere was surgically controlled. I sat at the head of the 20-foot mahogany table, finalizing the terms of a $200 million Series C funding round. Surrounding me were 6 of the most ruthless venture capitalists on the eastern seaboard. And they weren't looking at the projection screen. They were looking at me, waiting for my final concession on the equity dilution. I had spent the last 8 months orchestrating this exact moment. I held the room in the palm of my hand. The absolute authority of my position was unquestioned until the heavy glass doors violently swung open. My director of security, a former federal agent who rarely spoke above a whisper, walked in. He looked uncharacteristically pale. So behind him was a man who categorically did not belong on the executive floor. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting windbreaker, clutching a thick manila envelope and breathing heavily as if he had just fought his way past the lobby barricades. The conversation at the table died instantly. The silence in the boardroom became sudden and suffocating. "I apologize for the extreme interruption," my security director said, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. But this individual invoked a municipal civil mandate. He threatened to have the local precinct arrest the lobby staff for obstruction of a court order if I didn't escort him directly to you. Before I could even process the legal absurdity of the statement, the man in the windbreaker stepped forward, completely ignoring the billionaire investors sitting around the table. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't lower his voice to preserve my dignity. He weaponized the silence of the room. "Are you the chief executive officer of this corporation?" the man asked, his voice booming with the practiced, mechanical volume of someone who delivers bad news for a living. "I am," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level, though a cold spike of adrenaline was already flooding my system. "And you are currently trespassing in a secured commercial facility." "Not according to the county clerk, I'm not," he shot back, stepping right up to the head of the mahogany table. He slapped the thick manila envelope down onto the polished wood with a loud, echoing smack. "You have been officially served with a 5-day expedited notice to quit and a mandatory municipal eviction order. You are ordered to vacate the premises of your primary residence immediately due to severe, malicious defaulting of your lease agreement. Have a nice day." He turned on his heel and marched out of the glass boardroom, escorted out by a paralyzed security director. For 10 agonizing seconds, to nobody moved, the 6 venture capitalists, individuals who managed billions of dollars and thrived on corporate stability, stared at the manila envelope resting in front of me as if it were an unexploded bomb. The optics were catastrophic. An executive who couldn't even manage their own housing, who was being aggressively and publicly evicted for malicious defaulting, was not an executive you trusted with $200 million in venture capital. "Gentlemen," I said, had my voice barely holding its structural integrity, "I need a 10-minute recess to address an administrative error." They didn't argue. They silently stood up, gathered their legal pads, and filed out of the room, their eyes averting mine. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them. I was entirely alone. The biological shock hit me with the force of a freight train. The adrenaline crash was instantaneous and violent. I collapsed back into my heavy leather chair, my lungs seized. The sheer or breathtaking magnitude of the public humiliation broke through the impenetrable corporate armor I had spent 15 years forging. I put my hands over my face, and for the first time in a decade, I sobbed. I wept in the empty boardroom, my chest heaving, completely humiliated, entirely shattered by the sheer audacity of the attack. But tears are a finite biological response. They burn out. 3 minutes later, the sobbing stopped. The humiliation evaporated, replaced entirely by a freezing, absolute zero clarity. I wiped my face, sat up straight, and reached for the manila envelope. I pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I didn't look at the screaming red eviction stamp on the front page. I am a strategist. I bypass the threat and look for the mechanism. I flipped directly to the sworn municipal affidavits and the attached, supposed, Master Lease Agreement. I bought my estate 5 years ago. It is a sprawling, multi-million-dollar property in a gated enclave. And I paid for it in cash. There is no mortgage. There is no landlord. The concept of me being evicted from a house I own outright was a mathematical impossibility. Yet there it was, printed in stark black ink on the county court letterhead. Master landlords and primary title holders, Arthur and Eleanor Vance. Subtenant in default, the chief executive officer, my parents. I stared at their names, my mind instantly reverse engineering the sociopathic architecture of their fraud. 2 years ago, they lost their retirement in a series of disastrous, highly leveraged day trading gambles. Out of a misplaced sense of filial duty, I moved them into the detached, 2,000-square-foot guest wing of my estate. I covered their utilities, their groceries, their medical insurance. I gave them a soft place to land. In return, they spent the last 24 months quietly plotting to steal my empire. I analyzed the forged Master Lease Agreement attached to the eviction notice. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. It falsely claimed that they were the original rightful owners of the estate and that they had graciously leased the main house to me. The document was meticulously backdated and featured a spectacular forgery of my signature. They had then taken this fraudulent document to a municipal housing court, swore under penalty of perjury that I was a hostile, non-paying squatter who was destroying their property, and secured an expedited eviction order. But why? And they knew they couldn't actually kick me out. They knew a simple property deed check would eventually expose the lie. Then I looked through the glass walls of the boardroom, out toward the lobby where the venture capitalists were whispering amongst themselves. The realization clicked into place like a loaded magazine. This wasn't about the house. It was about the leverage. My parents knew I was in the middle of a $200 million funding round. They knew that in the high-stakes world of venture capital, absolute pristine reputation is the only currency that matters. They orchestrated a highly public, maximally humiliating scene with the process server to create a scandal. They wanted the rumors to spread. They wanted the board of directors to panic. They expected me to be sitting in this chair, crying in defeat, terrified of the media finding out that a prominent CEO was being dragged through eviction courts for being a deadbeat. And they expected me to call them in a blind panic, begging them to drop the fake lawsuit to save my funding round. And when I made that call, they would demand a $10 million settlement to quietly withdraw the eviction and disappear. They were using the municipal court system to execute a flawless, high society extortion racket. I carefully placed the forged lease agreement back onto the mahogany table. I didn't reach for my phone to call my family lawyer, and I didn't call the police to report a forgery. You don't respond to a tactical nuclear strike with a polite legal dispute. My parents had spent months researching municipal housing laws, studying my signature, and tracking my corporate calendar to execute this public humiliation perfectly. But in their arrogant, greedy rush to corner me in front of my investors, they made a catastrophic failure in their due diligence. They pulled the public records for the house from 4 years ago. They forged my signature as a private citizen. They didn't realize that 24 months ago, I had quietly, legally, and permanently transferred the absolute title of that estate into an irrevocable blind trust, fully managed and federally protected by the Institutional Wealth Division of J.P. Morgan Chase. My parents hadn't just committed civil fraud against their daughter. They had just sworn under oath in a court of law to steal a multi-million-dollar asset directly from a federally insured banking institution. I unlocked my phone and dialed the unlisted direct line to the J.P. Morgan Institutional Litigation Department. The sobbing was over. The execution was about to begin. The polished aluminum phone receiver felt cold against my ear. The direct unlisted line to the J.P. Morgan Institutional Litigation Department did not ring a second time. It connected immediately to an automated, encrypted routing system designed explicitly for high-net-worth corporate clients managing assets exceeding $50 million. I entered my secure, 16-digit, alphanumeric client authentication code on the keypad. The system verified my identity in less than 3 seconds. J.P. Morgan Institutional Legal and Fraud Division. This is Senior Counsel Harrison. How may we direct your immediate concern, Ms. Vance? The voice on the other end was not a customer service representative. It was a razor-sharp, highly compensated federal litigator whose sole professional existence was dedicated to protecting the bank's massive, structured assets from catastrophic liability. Harrison's tone was entirely devoid of warmth. It was a pure, highly calibrated instrument of institutional power. "Mr. Harrison," I stated, my voice matching his absolute freezing precision. I didn't shake. I didn't convey an ounce of the humiliation that had brought me to tears 10 minutes prior. I require the immediate activation of the title defense protocol for the residential asset currently held within the Vance Irrevocable Blind Trust. I heard the rapid, precise clacking of a mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line as Harrison instantly pulled up the deeply encrypted multi-million-dollar file. "I have the trust portfolio open, Ms. Vance," Harrison confirmed, his voice dropping into a register of intense, clinical focus. "The primary residential asset is a clear title, unencumbered estate valued at approximately $12.5 million. There are no active liens, no secondary mortgages, and no authorized external lease agreements on file. Please state the nature of the breach." I picked up the forged municipal eviction notice from the mahogany table. I didn't read the dramatic, threatening language my parents had spent weeks drafting. I read the legal mechanics of their suicide note. 30 minutes ago, a municipal process server delivered a sworn or expedited eviction notice to my corporate headquarters, I explained, delivering the facts with the detached, lethal efficiency of a forensic auditor. The petitioners are Arthur and Eleanor Vance. They have submitted a fraudulent, backdated Master Lease Agreement to the County Housing Court. They have forged my signature as a private citizen. They are currently attempting to legally claim primary ownership of the estate, and they are executing a public eviction under penalty of perjury. The silence on the line was profound. It wasn't the silence of confusion, it was the terrifying, heavy silence of a massive financial institution, realizing that an external entity had just attempted to steal one of its protected $12 million assets using forged municipal paperwork. "Ms. Vance," Harrison finally said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a sudden, overwhelming institutional fury. "Are you stating for the official record that Arthur and Eleanor Vance have submitted sworn, notarized documents to a sitting municipal judge claiming legal ownership of an asset that is exclusively and irreversibly owned by J.P. Morgan Chase?" "That is exactly what I am stating, Mr. Harrison," I replied smoothly, the trap completely armed and ready to deploy. "They pulled outdated public property records from 4 years ago. They are entirely unaware of the blind trust structure. They believe they are committing a simple, highly humiliating civil fraud against their daughter to force a $10 million extortion settlement to save my current venture capital funding round. They do not realize they have just initiated a hostile, fraudulent takeover of a federally insured bank asset. They have committed massive, undeniable federal mortgage and wire fraud," Harrison stated, his fingers flying across the keyboard, already drafting the catastrophic legal response. "By filing that forged lease agreement in a municipal court, they have also committed felony perjury and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. This is no longer a family dispute, Ms. Vance. This is a direct, aggressive attack on the integrity of J.P. Morgan's institutional holdings." I am entirely aware of the federal implications, Mr. Harrison, I said, leaning back in my heavy leather chair, the absolute zero temperature of my revenge finally settling into my bones. Or I do not want a quiet settlement. I do not want a simple dismissal of the municipal eviction. I want the bank to crush them with the full, unmitigated weight of the federal government. I want the FBI involved. The J.P. Morgan Fraud Division does not settle when our assets are directly attacked with forged documents, Harrison assured me, the terrifying machinery of the banking giant grinding into gear. I am immediately dispatching our elite team of federal litigators to intercept this municipal eviction hearing. I am also forwarding this entire authenticated dossier to our direct liaison at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Task Force. Your parents have just walked willingly into a federal slaughterhouse. The municipal eviction hearing is scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. in courtroom 4B. I provided, sliding the forged notice back into the manila envelope. Wait, they expect me to show up alone, crying and desperate to sign a $10 million non-disclosure agreement to make the scandal go away. You will not be alone, Ms. Vance, Harrison promised, the call ending with a sharp, decisive click. I set the polished aluminum receiver back onto the console. I stood up from the head of the mahogany table, my posture flawless, my corporate armor entirely restored. The humiliation of the process server, the panic of the venture capitalists, the sheer, staggering arrogance of my parents' extortion plot, all of it was irrelevant now. I walked over to the heavy glass doors of the boardroom and pushed them open. The entire executive floor was dead silent. 300 employees, assistants, and vice presidents were pretending to work, their eyes darting nervously toward me, fully aware that their CEO had just been publicly served with an eviction notice. The 6 venture capitalists were standing in a tight group near the elevators, looking incredibly uncomfortable, preparing to quietly exit the building and pull their $200 million investment. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer a frantic, desperate explanation. I walked directly toward them with the absolute terrifying confidence of a woman who had just weaponized a $12 million federal bank trust. "Gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying cleanly across the silent lobby, projecting pure, unassailable authority. "The administrative error has been entirely neutralized. A hostile external party attempted a severely flawed, fraudulent maneuver to leverage my personal assets. The matter has been escalated directly to the federal level, and the hostile party is currently facing imminent, catastrophic federal indictment." The lead venture capitalist, a 60-year-old billionaire who had survived 3 market crashes, stopped in his tracks. He looked at my face, searching for a single trace of panic or a single crack in my composure. He found absolutely nothing but cold, weaponized steel. "Federal indictment?" he repeated, his eyebrows raising in profound, sudden respect. "We are returning to the boardroom," I commanded, turning on my heel without waiting for an answer. "We have a $200 million Series C funding, round to finalize, and I am no longer offering the 3% equity concession." They followed me back into the glass room without a single word of protest. The municipal housing courts are not designed for high-stakes corporate warfare. They are triage centers for human misery. Courtroom 4B was a windowless, suffocating room characterized by peeling veneer benches, fluorescent lights that hummed with a migraine-inducing frequency, and a parade of exhausted clerks processing endless stacks of broken leases and unpaid rent disputes. It was an environment built for desperation and rapid, standardized judgments, and it was the absolute last place on earth a chief executive officer in the middle of a $200 million funding round should ever be seen, which was exactly why my parents had chosen it. I arrived at exactly 8:55 a.m. I walked down the center aisle, ignoring the crowded gallery of disgruntled landlords and anxious tenants. I did not scan the room nervously. I did not project the aura of a woman whose reputation was hanging by a thread. I simply unlatched the swinging wooden gate, where I walked into the well of the court and took my seat at the respondent's table. I placed a single slim leather portfolio in front of me and folded my hands over it. Arthur and Eleanor were already seated at the petitioner's table, less than 10 feet away. They looked entirely out of place in the grim municipal setting, and they were radiating a toxic, overwhelming smugness. Arthur was leaning back in his chair, casually checking the face of his heavy gold watch, to treating the courtroom like a minor inconvenience before a celebratory brunch. Eleanor was whispering to their legal representation, a slick, aggressive local litigator who usually handled mid-level personal injury claims and slip-and-fall lawsuits. The lawyer looked practically vibrating with adrenaline, clearly believing he was minutes away from securing a percentage of a massive, quiet corporate payout. Before the judge even entered the room, the local litigator stood up and walked over to my table. He leaned heavily on the wooden divider, sliding a thick, freshly printed legal packet toward me. "Miss Vance," the lawyer whispered, his tone attempting to balance false sympathy with outright extortion. "My clients have authorized me to offer you a one-time, immediate exit strategy. We understand the sensitive nature of your current venture capital negotiations. Now, if you sign this comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and execute a wire transfer of $10 million to the account routed on page 4, we will withdraw the eviction petition with prejudice before the judge takes the bench. You save your company. My clients recover their alleged damages. Nobody speaks to the press." I looked down at the extortion demand. $10 million to make a forged document disappear. It was a breathtakingly audacious racket. She orchestrated entirely on the assumption that my fear of public humiliation would override my financial logic. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't even touch the document. I slowly raised my eyes and locked my gaze directly onto Arthur. Arthur stopped checking his watch. He leaned forward, expecting to see a broken, defeated daughter ready to surrender her capital to save her empire. He expected pleading. He expected a frantic negotiation. "I don't negotiate with domestic terrorists." Arthur," I stated. My voice was pitched low, devoid of any emotional fluctuation, carrying cleanly across the 10 feet of empty space separating us. "You had a comfortable life. You had a secure, paid-off roof over your heads. And in exactly 3 minutes, you are going to lose absolutely everything." Arthur's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but his sheer arrogance quickly paved over the doubt. He let out a short, patronizing laugh, shaking his head. "You always were too stubborn for your own good," Arthur muttered, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Let's see how stubborn you are when the bailiff drags your belongings onto the curb and your investors read about it in the Wall Street Journal." "All rise!" the bailiff suddenly barked, cutting off any further extortion attempts. Judge Miller, a tired, no-nonsense magistrate who looked like he had already processed 30 evictions before his morning coffee, took the bench. Then he slammed his gavel down, shuffling through the massive stack of municipal dockets. "Docket number 409-B, Vance versus Vance," Judge Miller called out, adjusting his reading glasses. He looked down at the paperwork, immediately irritated by the anomaly of the address. "An expedited eviction notice for a $12 million gated estate. Counsel, you are in a municipal housing court. Why isn't this being handled in a civil partition suit or a higher district court?" The local litigator practically leaped to the podium, eager to execute the public character assassination. "Because it is a straightforward, malicious squatter situation, Your Honor," the lawyer announced, his voice booming to ensure the entire gallery could hear the humiliation. "My clients, Arthur and Eleanor Vance, are the primary leaseholders and rightful master tenants of the property, or the respondent is their adult daughter. She has flagrantly violated the terms of the Master Lease Agreement, defaulted on her subtenant financial obligations, and is engaged in a hostile refusal to vacate. We have submitted the signed, notarized lease agreement into evidence. We are requesting an immediate, mandatory writ of possession." Judge Miller frowned, flipping through the file to find the forged lease. He looked over at me, sitting completely alone at the respondent's table. "Ms. Vance," Judge Miller said, his tone skeptical, "do you have legal representation present to contest this notarized lease agreement, or are you prepared to vacate the premises?" I didn't answer him immediately. I didn't need to, because at that exact second, the heavy double doors at the back of the municipal courtroom swung open with a synchronized, heavy thud. The chaotic murmur of the gallery died instantly. 4 individuals walked down the center aisle. One, they did not look like municipal housing lawyers. They moved with the frictionless, predatory glide of apex institutional litigators. They were wearing immaculate, razor-sharp tailoring. They were carrying heavy, locked, federal-grade evidence briefcases. And they walked past the wooden swinging gate without waiting for the bailiff's permission. At the head of the phalanx was Senior Counsel Harrison. Harrison stepped directly to the center podium, physically displacing Arthur's local litigator, or who instinctively stepped back from the sheer, overwhelming wave of corporate authority radiating from the J.P. Morgan team. "Excuse me, Counselor," Judge Miller demanded, his gavel raised, caught entirely off guard by the intrusion. "Who are you, and what is your business in my courtroom?" Harrison calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached into his breast pocket, and extracted a solid gold-embossed credential card, handing it directly to the bailiff to pass up to the bench. "Your Honor, my name is Marcus Harrison," he stated, his voice resonating with a terrifying, calibrated calm that instantly froze the air in courtroom 4B. "I am Senior Litigation Counsel for the Institutional Wealth and Fraud Division of J.P. Morgan Chase." At the petitioner's table, Arthur Vance suddenly stopped breathing. Eleanor's hands clamped onto the edge of the wooden table. Their local lawyer looked frantically between Harrison and his clients, entirely unaware of what was happening. "I am not here to represent the respondent, Your Honor," Harrison continued, his gaze locking onto the judge. "I am here to formally intervene and assert absolute jurisdiction on behalf of a federally insured banking institution. The property in question does not belong to Arthur or Eleanor Vance. It does not belong to the respondent. That $12 million estate is the primary unencumbered asset of an irrevocable blind trust, fully managed, legally owned, and actively protected by J.P. Morgan Chase." Judge Miller physically recoiled, dropping the forged lease agreement onto his desk as if it had suddenly caught fire. He stared at Harrison, the catastrophic legal implications crashing down on him. If J.P. Morgan owns the title through a blind trust. Judge Miller started, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "Then the lease agreement currently sitting on your desk is a mathematical impossibility, Your Honor," Harrison confirmed, to delivering the lethal blow with surgical precision. He turned his head slowly, locking his eyes onto Arthur's completely drained, horrified face. "Arthur and Eleanor Vance have not just filed a fraudulent eviction against their daughter. They have utilized a meticulously forged document, sworn under penalty of perjury, in a coordinated attempt to illegally lay claim to a massive, federally protected bank asset." Harrison reached into his locked briefcase and pulled out a thick, red-banded federal dossier, slamming it onto the municipal podium. "This is no longer a municipal housing dispute, Your Honor," Harrison declared, the trap snapping shut with deafening finality. "This is an active, multi-million-dollar federal bank fraud." The silence that followed Senior Counsel Harrison's declaration was not the respectful, administrative quiet of a municipal courtroom. It was a total, suffocating vacuum, and it was the sound of a catastrophic legal implosion happening in real time. Judge Miller stared at the thick, red-banded federal dossier resting on his cheap wooden podium. He slowly reached out, picked up the forged Master Lease Agreement that Arthur had so confidently submitted 10 minutes earlier, and held it between his thumb and forefinger as if the paper itself were laced with weaponized anthrax. He looked from the document to Harrison, and then slowly shifted his gaze toward the petitioner's table. "Counselor," Judge Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, addressing Arthur's local litigator with a tone of absolute, unforgiving judicial menace. "Did you, or your firm, run a standardized, up-to-date chain of title verification on this $12 million estate before you walked into my courtroom and filed a sworn eviction notice under penalty of perjury?" The local litigator's face drained of all blood, and he looked exactly like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine, and the judge had just heard the click. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look at Eleanor. The survival instinct of a bottom-feeding lawyer is a terrifyingly rapid mechanism. "Your Honor," the litigator stammered, his voice cracking, physically stepping away from the wooden table to distance himself from his own clients. He raised both hands in a gesture of frantic surrender. "I must state for the immediate, official record that my firm was retained entirely on the presumption of good faith. My clients provided the Master Lease Agreement. They explicitly assured me they were the rightful title holders. I had absolutely zero knowledge of any irrevocable blind trust, nor any involvement by J.P. Morgan Chase. I moved to instantly withdraw as counsel for Arthur and Eleanor Vance, effective this exact second." "Motion granted," Judge Miller snapped, slamming his gavel down with a sharp, violent crack. Then he pointed a heavy finger directly at the lawyer. "Sit in the gallery and do not leave this room. I am immediately impounding these documents as evidence of felony contempt of a municipal court." At the petitioner's table, the arrogant country club facade finally shattered. Arthur Vance, the man who had spent the last 24 months plotting to humiliate me, suddenly understood the sheer, terrifying scale of the trap he had walked into. He stood up, his expensive linen suit suddenly looking entirely absurd. He looked at Harrison, the 4 federal litigators, the judge, and finally, he looked directly at me. "This is ridiculous," Arthur shouted, his voice pitching upward into a desperate, reedy panic, abandoning all legal strategy and resorting to the pathetic defense of biology. "She is my daughter. We are having a private family dispute over a property arrangement. You can't just barge in here and claim a bank owns the house. I know for a fact she bought it in cash 5 years ago. Her name is on the original deed." I sat perfectly still at the respondent's table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I didn't need to physically dominate the space. The architecture of my revenge was already doing it for me. "My name was on the deed, Arthur," I stated, my voice echoing with the clinical, detached precision of an auditor delivering a fatal balance sheet. 5 years ago. But unlike you, I do not leave my assets exposed to hostile liabilities. 2 years ago, prior to entering my Series B funding round, I executed a comprehensive asset protection strategy to shield my real estate from corporate litigation. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the slim leather portfolio. I transferred the absolute, unencumbered title of the estate into an irrevocable blind trust, I explained. So watching the blood fully drain from Eleanor's face as she finally grasped the financial mechanics of her own doom. "Do you understand what irrevocable means, Arthur? It means the transfer cannot be undone. It means I ceased to be the legal owner of that property 24 months ago. I am merely a beneficiary of the trust. I cannot be evicted from a property I do not own, and you cannot lease a property you do not possess." I paused, letting the absolute zero temperature of the room sink into their bones. "You thought you were outsmarting a vulnerable daughter," I continued, the whisper cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. "You didn't verify the current municipal records because you assumed I was too sentimental to corporatize my own home. You forged a lease agreement and swore an oath to steal an asset that is legally owned, managed, and fiercely defended by the largest banking institution in the United States. You didn't defraud me, Arthur. You attempted to defraud the federal banking system." Eleanor let out a wretched, suffocating gasp. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of her actions triggered a full-blown panic attack. She realized that they hadn't just lost the house, they had lost their freedom. "Ms. Vance is entirely correct," Senior Counsel Harrison interjected, pivoting flawlessly to deliver the institutional finishing blow. Ninahi opened the red-banded dossier on the podium. According to Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1344, executing a scheme to defraud a federally insured financial institution, or to obtain any of the assets owned by that institution by means of false or fraudulent pretenses, such as a forged Master Lease Agreement, is a federal felony. Harrison didn't look at Arthur with anger. He looked at him the way a highly efficient machine looks at an error code before deleting it. JP. The Morgan Chase does not tolerate fraudulent encumbrances on our trust assets, Harrison stated cleanly, the institutional power radiating from every syllable. We've already filed an emergency injunction in federal court to permanently bar you from the premises. Furthermore, our internal fraud division does not handle criminal prosecutions. We outsource them. Harrison turned his head slightly and nodded toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. When the doors swung open for the third and final time, the individuals who entered were not wearing tailored suits. They were wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI Financial Crimes Task Force printed boldly across the back. 6 heavily armed federal agents marched down the center aisle, their tactical boots thudding against the cheap linoleum floor. "Arthur and Eleanor Vance," the lead agent announced, his voice booming with unquestionable federal authority, completely overriding the municipal jurisdiction of the room. He bypassed the wooden gate and walked directly to the petitioner's table. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and multiple counts of wire fraud." Arthur's knees buckled. He physically collapsed back into his chair, his mouth opening and closing silently, utterly lobotomized by the sheer speed and violence of his destruction. Eleanor screamed, a high-pitched, hysterical wail that bounced off the windowless walls of courtroom 4B. "Please, Claire, tell them to stop," Eleanor shrieked, reaching her trembling hands out toward me as the federal agents forcefully pulled her arms behind her back, the cold steel of the handcuffs ratcheting shut with a heavy metallic clack. "We are your parents. We gave you everything. It was just a mistake. Tell the bank to drop it. Claire!" I didn't flinch. I didn't break eye contact. I watched the federal agents lock the handcuffs onto my father's wrists, ripping his expensive linen jacket in the process. "Please, Claire, tell them to stop!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice shattering as the cold steel of the federal handcuffs ratcheted shut around her wrists. She reached her trembling, restrained hands out toward me, her eyes wide with a feral, unadulterated terror. "We are your parents. We gave you everything. It was just a mistake. Tell the bank to drop it. Claire." I didn't flinch. I didn't break eye contact. I slowly stood up from the respondent's table, gathering my slim leather portfolio. I looked down at the 2 people who had spent the last 2 years living in my guest house, eating my food, and secretly plotting to publicly humiliate me for a $10 million ransom. "You didn't make a mistake, Eleanor," I stated, my voice echoing in the windowless municipal courtroom with the absolute freezing clarity of a death sentence. "A mistake is a clerical error. You spent weeks researching municipal housing codes. You practiced forging my signature. You intentionally waited until I was sitting in a glass boardroom with $200 million of venture capital on the line to send a process server to humiliate me. You executed a highly calculated, malicious extortion protocol." Arthur, his expensive linen suit torn at the shoulder where the federal agent had forcefully subdued him, looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. The arrogant country club facade had been entirely erased, replaced by the pathetic, hollow realization that his life was effectively over. "Claire, please," Arthur begged, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. "We'll sign whatever you want. We'll leave the state. Just don't let them take us to federal lockup. You can't do this to your own flesh and blood." "I am not doing anything to you, Arthur," I replied, my tone completely detached, when as if I were observing a failing competitor going bankrupt. "I didn't call the FBI. The Institutional Fraud Division of J.P. Morgan Chase called the FBI. You chose to forge documents laying claim to a $12 million asset owned by a federally insured bank. You triggered a federal mechanism that I cannot stop, even if I wanted to. You played a sociopathic game of financial Russian roulette, and you pulled the trigger yourselves." I turned my back on them and looked at Senior Counsel Harrison. The J.P. Morgan litigator stood at the podium, completely unmoved by the emotional breakdown happening 10 feet away. He gave me a single sharp nod of profound professional respect. "Take them out," the lead FBI agent commanded. They didn't go quietly. Eleanor sobbed hysterically, her legs giving out, forcing two agents to physically drag her down the center aisle. Arthur simply hung his head, shuffling forward in his handcuffs, a broken, ruined man. The heavy double doors of courtroom 4B swung shut behind them, sealing their fate and plunging the room back into a stunned, breathless silence. Judge Miller, who had remained completely silent during the federal intervention, slowly let out a long breath. He looked at the discarded forged lease agreement on his desk, then looked at Harrison and finally at me. "Ms. Vance," Judge Miller said, and his voice stripped of all its previous morning irritation, replaced by a deep, cautious reverence. "The municipal eviction petition is hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice. Jurisdiction is formally yielded to the United States Department of Justice. You are free to go." "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied smoothly. I walked out of the courtroom, flanked by the phalanx of J.P. Morgan federal litigators. I didn't look back. I had a meeting to finish. When I returned to my corporate headquarters exactly 45 minutes after the process server had originally breached my boardroom. The 6 venture capitalists were still sitting at the mahogany table. They had spent the entire time frantically researching the municipal records on their phones, trying to understand how a CEO could be evicted from her own estate. When I walked back into the room, perfectly composed, carrying my leather portfolio, they went completely silent. "The hostile liability has been permanently liquidated by the federal government," I announced, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Now, regarding the Series C valuation, as I stated prior to the interruption, the 3% equity concession is no longer on the table. The valuation stands at $200 million. You have 5 minutes to sign the term sheet, or I am taking this round to Sequoia Capital." The lead billionaire investor stared at me. He had just witnessed an executive get publicly attacked by her own family, neutralize the threat using a $12 million blind trust, orchestrate a federal arrest, and return to work without breaking a single sweat. He didn't see a liability. He saw an absolute, terrifying apex predator. He picked up his gold fountain pen and signed the document without a single word of argument. The fallout was a masterpiece of institutional velocity. Because my parents had officially submitted the forged documents to a municipal judge, the paper trail was undeniably authenticated. The Department of Justice didn't even need to conduct a lengthy investigation. They simply collected the sworn affidavits and the banking records. Arthur and Eleanor were indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and felony forgery. I'm unable to afford high-priced defense attorneys because the FBI had immediately frozen their remaining day trading accounts. They were forced to accept a brutal plea deal. They were sentenced to 8 years in a federal correctional facility. But the federal government wasn't their only problem. As an added penalty, J.P. Morgan Chase's legal division successfully sued them in civil court for the cost of the federal litigation. Now, the bank ruthlessly seized the last remaining assets my parents possessed, their luxury cars, Eleanor's jewelry, and the modest pension Arthur had managed to hide. The institution completely, systematically liquidated them. My empire remains entirely uncompromised. The Series C funding round overperformed, driving our corporate valuation past the $1 billion mark. My estate remains perfectly silent. and my name and my assets belong entirely to me. Yen, if your parents moved into your guest house, secretly forged a Master Lease Agreement, and sent a process server to humiliate you in front of billionaire investors just to extort $10 million, would you have given them a chance to explain? Or would you have quietly activated the Federal Litigation Department of a massive banking institution and let the FBI drag them out of court in handcuffs? Let me know exactly how you would handle this level of sociopathic betrayal in the comments below. If you love this story of cold, calculating corporate justice, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.